Corridors for grizzlies, assessing habitat connectivity in and around Yellowstone National Park. Migratory routes are hugely important for the well-being and stability of a species. Understanding their movements and routes is complex, especially considering how different each animal operates. Learning more about them and what influences them to avoid certain areas is of great interest to road ecologists and conservation. Further, corridors can be of great use for safe animal crossings. Corridors can and will become more and more popular as they are understood better, but as of now, nobody exactly sure what constitutes a good or great corridor. Many different animals would potentially use a corridor, which makes it even more difficult to make a universal corridor that works for all wildlife. A grizzly bear needs an enormous amount of space while migrating, so the corridors need to be very large and obvious for them to find. On the other hand, you have much smaller animals that only need a couple square miles of habitat for their entire life. Predators and prey also migrate and disperse differently, so it's easy to see how complex these problems can become. One thing is rather agreed upon. Watching animals interact with natural barriers and corridors will be the best way to understand and properly implement corridors for the future. The Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative is an example of a large-scale connectivity project. It aims to connect the large historic ecosystem and migration routes between the Yukon and Yellowstone region. With over 300 partner groups and two nations, there are both single species and ecosystem connectivity projects that are being addressed. The organizations and the larger wildlife goal see the importance of these animals and understand their need for space and land in search of mates, foods, new home, or migration in general. The Y2Y vision was official in 1993 and has just celebrated 20 years of work. This 2,000 plus mile range is utilized by wolves, lynx, black bears, grizzly bears, and golden eagles, among other species. These animals are iconic to this land, so it's impossible to underestimate the importance. The Y2Y vision looking forward wants to focus on areas of key wildlife movement routes, introduce new policy that protects land and promotes areas for corridors and connectivity, restore and treat habitat that has been harmed by invasive plants, and also decommission and restore old roads that still fragment the land. Grizzly bears have especially suffered from habitat loss and is a species of high priority within the Y2Y project. Yellowstone grizzly populations have almost altogether been cut off from the rest of the North American population. The severity cannot be understated. Roughly 100,000 grizzlies once traveled between Alaska and Mexico, as depicted by the light red on the map. The more vibrant red represents the current range they occupy. The Yellowstone patch is clearly vulnerable and in need of restoration efforts. The Y2Y vision has made a huge impact in the Canada and Yukon area. The Yellowstone greater ecosystem has gotten a lot of attention for conservation, but grizzlies in that region are in desperate need of reconnecting with the continent's population and quality habitat. My work was on grizzly bears and is concerned with their previously mentioned diminishing habitat. For their revival, the Yellowstone grizzly area must be restored and act as a mainland for connectivity. Corridors and wildlife overpasses have been very useful in other areas like Banff National Park in Alberta, Canada. There is good protection north of the border, and I want to possibly locate areas near Yellowstone where similar structures could be used. Identifying close and sizable patches of habitat will be the best method as understood through the laws of island biogeography. New mapping technology like GIS and Linkage Mapper will also be useful for locating good areas to start with. The image on the left is a representation of the laws of island biogeography. These laws tell us that colonization and biodiversity will occur most in islands that are close and large in relation to the mainland. For my work, Yellowstone National Park served as the mainland for grizzly habitat. For identifying spots for expanding their range, large and nearby patches will be the best course of action as explained by the laws. As the habitat expands, It will gradually become easier to keep adding patches on all sides of the island. Again, the ultimate goal is to reconnect them to the rest of the continent's population. My research question was, what locations around Yellowstone National Park can connect grizzly bear habitat and ultimately best protect the necessary land to restore the larger Yellowstone to Yukon ecosystem? The red on the map below represents the focus area. Figure 1 was created with the protected lands and area layer on GIS. The green represents the Yellowstone area with additional patches of protected areas that I have picked. The purpose of adding other patches is again to expand grizzly habitat for the isolated Yellowstone population. Before expanding the habitat, the type of landscape around Yellowstone needs to be known. Using GIS, I ran the wilderness layer and zoomed in on Yellowstone's general area, as shown by Figure 2 on the right. The brown color represents areas that have high human activity, and as it changes to yellow to light blue, it represents more wild area. It is clear that not all areas and landscapes around Yellowstone are suitable for connectivity, so picking the specific ones will be all the more important. Linkage Mapper is a relatively new tool for GIS and connectivity mapping. The tool identifies specific routes for corridors and uses the cost distance layer, among others, to locate the optimal route or routes for wildlife. In Figure 3, the two lines are the linkage map calculated routes for corridors. Behind that is a cost distance layer, which calculates a route that will have the least outside interaction from humans for grizzly bears or wildlife in general. The black represents the lowest cost distance, and as it goes to white, the cost distance is higher. Again, corridors and patches for expansion should be locations that have low cost distance, which appears to be the case in Figure 3. Obviously, there are complications in logistics, but with mapping tools, it is clear there are areas outside Yellowstone that could be stored and connected to for the benefit of grizzly bears. For more effective conservation, tools like Linkage Mapper and GIS in general will be of great use. They are good for modeling and planning before actually implementing change. Ultimately, targeting all sides and edges of Yellowstone for connection will be needed, but my research focuses on patches on the northern side. Corridors and methods for connectivity is an exciting new field. Projects and organizations within Y2Y do an important job at both species-specific and larger connectivity projects. Both are very important. These types of projects seem to be the future scale at which conservation will be looked at. The wildlife see no borders in national parks, protected areas, states, islands of habitat we've identified, and even nations. So in helping them, our efforts must mimic their needs and patterns for the best possible outcome. These are the data sources I used with GIS.